Story number 3. Why Korea was so poor before 1960s. In the previous lecture, I explained why Korea's economic development was called a miracle. I told that Korea's GDP per capita increased so fast and so much, and people's living standard improved very much for the past 60 years. At the same time, I explained that Korea has succeeded in upgrading its industrial structure for years. For example, major industry has changed from the agricultural industry to the manufacturing and service industry for the past half centuries. Capital and technology incentive sectors became more important than before. Today, I'd like to show what happened at the early days of development in Korea. In other words, I'm telling you why Korea was so poor at the time. In this section, I'd like to apply a simple economic theory called production function. It's because it may help to understand the situation of Korea in old day. At the same time, if you apply it, we may say why Korea became so rich right now compared with the old days. Production function is a mathematical function to show the relationship between input and output. It describes the relationship between input and output of the production process. If anyone or any country like to produce something, it should have some input and producing process. For example, if you like to produce the rices, you must have some input. The seed of rice, land, water, fertilizer are the must. Without these input, you cannot produce the rice. Of course, some human labor should be provided too. Either you work or you must hire somebody. Without human labor, anything can be produced. Furthermore, you should have some equipment or machine. They help to raise the production amount. Since the Stone Ages, people used tools and equipment to do his work. Some skills and technology must be given too. With better skills and advanced technology, people can produce more than before. There must be some legal system and traditions to be observed in the society. For example, labor contract between employer and employee must be observed. So one piece of rice are made by the farming process with the input of seed, land, water, human labor, equipment, technology under a certain economic and social system. This relationship can be expressed by the production function. In conclusion, we all know that something or some input should be provided to produce the rices. You might think another example. How about producing cars? There must be a factory with a machine and workers. The factory must have an appropriate technology and knowledge to produce a car. Of course, some raw materials such as iron and steel must be provided too. Some law and regulation must be observed. For example, car producing company must keep the environmental protection law and the safety law for the workers. All these stories can be expressed in the production function. So the y-equal function of L, K, LD, NR, TE, and others. Here, L and K means the labor and capital. LD and NR do the land and the natural resources. TE does the technology and skill. Others does the social and legal system. Therefore, this equation means that if any company or enterprise to put some amount of labor, capital, natural resources, and technology, under the given legal and social system, it can produce something. Or if any country like to produce something, at least it must have some input of labor, capital, natural resources and technology under a given legal and social system. It also means that if any country does not have such an input, it cannot produce anything. Which means that this country fall into a low-income country. I'm going to apply this theory to the economies of Korea in 1950s. In 53, just after 3 years of Korean War, Korea's annual GDP per capita was only $65.7. Why was it so low? And why the people's life at that time was so miserable? This is a question which I like to tackle now. For this purpose, I'm applying the production function theory, such that if any country like to produce something, it should have some input. Let's see how much of this each element of input did a newborn country called South Korea have at the time. The first element of the input is the natural resources. Many developing countries manage their incomes by exploiting their natural resources. For example, United Arab Emirates in Arabian Peninsula get rich when it became to export the oil to the rest of the world in 1960s. It is quite surprising that Korea has very little amount of natural resources. The Korea's land size is 100 square kilometers. About 70% of Korean land covers the hills and mountains, while the rest of them are plain. The hills and mountain areas did not have any economically important minerals. There were no oil, no natural gases, no coal or no iron cores. The plain area traditionally provided the food for the people. But at the time, even the food is not enough after the Korean War. So the food shortage problem was very serious in Korea. The second element of the input is the labor or human resources. The population of Korea is 25 million in 1950, but it reached 30 million in 1960. Given the land size of 100 square kilometers, Korea was one of the most densely populated countries in the world. As a result, we may say that there were a large number of available labor forces in Korea. However, this labor force did not generate the necessary income and production for the people. In 1960, 47% of the population is either less than 15 years old or older than 60 years old. In other words, more than half of the population were not able to participate in the labor forces. In 1990 and year 2020, the ratio of population between 15 and 20 years old rose to the 66.6% and 64.8% respectively. It means that in 1960, less people are involved in the economically active population. Actually, it was a burden on the economy. The quality of labor was not good either. According to the survey, large number of population were not properly educated. The illiteracy rate of Korea was very high before 1960s. When Korea became liberated in 1945 from Japan, the illiteracy rate is as high as 78%. In other words, 8 out of the 10 people could not read and write properly. How any country could do any economic development with such a high rate of illiteracy ratio. The third element was the capital and equipment of the company and society. 3 years of Korean War from 1950 to the 53 destroyed almost everything in Korea, including infrastructures or equipment of private factories. All nation was a battlefield during the wartime. Even after the war, some guerrilla battles occurred in the mountain areas of Korea for a long time. As I showed before, the Han River bridges, the only bridges connecting the southern part of Seoul and northern part of Seoul, was destroyed during the wartime. They had to cross the river by the temporary bridges for years. The electricity shortage problem was also very severe. Major electricity power plants were located at the North Korea. As a result, for a long time after the war, South Korea had difficulty to manage the electricity supply to the factory and residential areas. It was quite natural that once or twice electricity breakout happened almost every day until 1970s. Furthermore, many private buildings and factories were destroyed during the wartime. Fourth, there is not much accumulated knowledge and technology in Korea at the time. During the colonial period from 1910 to 1945, higher education to Korean people was strictly limited. Even the technical training for the Koreans was not allowed by Japanese colonial government. For example, in 1945, there are only 8,000 Korean college students in Korea. Of course, most of them are children of the Korean cooperative to the Japanese Empire. One of the first things Korean intelligent people did at the time is that to open a university in Korea. Of course, there are many Japanese technicians. However, after ending of the World War II, they left Korea. Fifth, Korea's social and economic system were very primitive at the time. In 1950s, Korea was not ready for the modern democratic and capitalistic economy. Dictatorship and corruption and the street protests were very common. Then, Korea had a students' revolution on April 19th on 1960. Then the president has to step down. We may understand this disorder if you're looking at the history of Korea. For a long time, Korea was a closed country. Politically, it was a traditional kingdom, and it has never had any official foreign relationship and foreign trade with Western European country until 1876. From 1910 to 1945, Korea was a colony of Japan. And with the defeat of Japan in World War II, Korea was liberated. Korea established its own republic in 1948 and adopted democratic and political social system. Soon, it had a war with North Korea for 3 years from 1950 to 53. Then, Korea has experienced a dictatorship under the President Syngman Lee and experienced a students' revolution in April 19th in 1960. So all this story means that before 1960s, Korea did not have the system of the modern capitalistic economy and democratic country. Large number of people did not understand the principle of capitalism and market economy. Now, it's time to answer the simple question. Why Korea was so poor in 1950s and early 60s? I think so you get some idea. Korea did not have any element to be used for the production activity, except less educated labor forces. It was quite natural that Korea's production was so little, or Korea's income level is so low in 1950s and early 1960s. Then, you may have a question, how Korea could survive under such harsh conditions? Foreign assistance was very important at the time. Let me show some interesting statistics. This figure shows the shares of foreign aid in total import and shares of foreign aid of total Korean government revenue. 1956, the shares of foreign aid in total import amounted 84.6%. It means that most of the import were aid from the foreign country. At the same time, it tells that Korea's government could not manage it by itself without foreign aid. Sometimes it covered about 50% of its revenue by the foreign aid. I think you may understand how miserable the newborn country called Korea and Korean people were at that time. Today, we check the economy of Korea in 1950s and early 60s. Next time, I will discuss the take-up of the economic development of Korea in 1960s. See you next time.